Foggy Bottom, Washington, D.C. The air in the conference room on the 5th floor of the CIA headquarters was thick with the scent of stale coffee and unburned ambition. Outside, the Capitol was locked in the icy grip of the Cold War, a conflict fought not with tanks and planes, but with whispers and shadows. Inside, a group of analysts and officers, led by the enigmatic Dr. Robert V. Wallace of the Office of Technical Services, OTS, stared at a large, grainy photograph projected onto the wall. It wasn't a missile silo or a nuclear submarine. It was the heavily guarded Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue. Gentlemen, the problem is simple and yet insurmountable. Wallace began, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded attention. He adjusted his thick, black-rimmed glasses, the fluorescent light glinting off the lenses. The Soviets are using advanced shielding. Our directional microphones, the parabolic dishes, the laser listening systems, they're all failing. The physical security, the sweeps, they're immaculate. We know key personnel are meeting, talking about troop movements, missile technology, nuclear parity, and we can't get near in the door. He tapped a pointer against the photo, highlighting the perimeter fence and the ubiquitous KGB patrols. What we need is an asset that can pass any physical security test, an asset that can move unnoticed into areas no human spy, no matter how skilled, could ever penetrate. An asset that is, for all intents and purposes, invisible. A tense silence filled the room. These men were accustomed to discussing microdots, cyanide pills hidden in fountain pens, and camera rigs the size of a matchbox. Now they were brainstorming on a wholly different scale of absurdity. One junior officer, a Lieutenant Commander Thomas Riley, coughed nervously. "Sir, with all due respect, short of teaching a squirrel to wiretap, I don't see how." Wallace cut him off with a wry smile. "Commander, your analogy is surprisingly close. Think organic. Think about the most common, unremarkable creature that moves through urban life unremarked upon, yet often right under our noses. What walks past Soviet guards without a second glance? What can be found perched on a windowsill or sleeping in an alleyway, directly adjacent to a secure communication line?" He pressed a button, and the image changed. The new photograph was a mundane, almost endearing sight. A fluffy domestic calico cat sitting patiently on the embassy's low stone wall, tail wrapped neatly around its paws. It was the perfect picture of innocence. "A cat," Wallace stated, letting the word hang in the charged air. Operation Acoustic Kitty. The name itself was a stroke of genius, both completely ridiculous and instantly memorable, a testament to the Cold War's flair for the dramatic and the absurd. The stunned reaction of his team was priceless. Wallace detailed the initial feasibility study, codenamed Project 150. The idea was to take a live, fully functioning cat, surgically implant a sophisticated eavesdropping device inside its body, train it to approach specific targets, and then essentially unleash it to become a furry, ambulatory microphone. The technical requirements were staggering. The device had to be minuscule. It had to run on a power source that wouldn't kill the animal. It had to transmit clear audio from inside a body cavity. The human ear canal is a marvel of biological engineering. The cat's was not designed for espionage. The primary challenge was the power source and the microphone. The solution, arrived at after months of internal debate and failed prototypes, was to install a microphone deep inside the cat's ear canal, a tiny transmitter at the base of the skull, and a very thin antenna woven directly into the long fur along its spine, trailing down its tail. A battery, necessary to power the small but powerful transmitter, would be placed, ironically, near the cat's chest. The initial budget request for this phase alone, Wallace concluded, is $15 million. We're proposing to turn a domestic house pet into a cutting-edge piece of surveillance hardware. The risks are enormous. The potential payoff is priceless. He looked around the room, meeting each man's skeptical gaze with steely determination. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Outside, the Soviet shadow loomed, demanding impossible solutions. A cat, a common calico, was about to become the CIA's most improbable secret agent, a biological platform for the highest-stakes eavesdropping mission in the history of the Cold War. The first steps in this bizarre, ethically dubious, and technologically challenging project were now officially underway. The war for information had just entered its most peculiar chapter, proving that in the battle between the East and West, no stone or living creature would be left unturned. The initial $15 million allocation, signed off with a mixture of bureaucratic resignation and cynical curiosity, immediately kick-started the most delicate phase of Operation Acoustic Kitty, turning a living creature into a reliable, mobile espionage platform. The CIA didn't call it vivisection. They called it system integration. The OTS team, under Dr. Wallace's constant, intense supervision, relocated to a discreet, high-security facility outside Langley, known only by the cryptic designation the Farm. Their first hurdle was biological, procuring the subjects and preparing them for the intricate surgery. They settled on domestic calico and tabby cats, common, inconspicuous, and generally cooperative subjects, though cooperation was a strong word for what followed. The animals were acquired from local shelters, the paperwork obfuscated through layers of shell companies. The lead surgeon on the project, a contract specialist with a background in veterinary medicine and battlefield trauma who went by the pseudonym Dr. Reed, was tasked with performing the procedure. The requirements handed to him by the engineers looked more like schematics for a circuit board than an operating brief for a mammal. The core components were microscopically small, demanding a precision that stretched the limits of 1960s surgical technology. The primary device was the microphone. It was essential that it capture sound waves directed toward the cat, yet the natural filtering of the outer ear and the auditory canal presented significant problems. After several disastrous initial attempts where the mic was placed too far in, causing neurological irritation, or too far out, picking up only wind and the cat's own internal gurgling, the team settled on implanting a 1 mm microphone in the cochlear region, near the opening of the ear canal, but securely fixed to the skull. This positioning was a constant source of pain for the animals and required continuous pain management research. Next came the power source. A standard battery was too large. Miniaturizing the necessary energy supply without sacrificing transmitting power became the bottleneck of the entire project. They developed a custom-made silver oxide battery, no bigger than a large lima bean, designed for maximum longevity and minimal heat generation. Dr. Reed carefully placed this battery inside the cat's rib cage, specifically near the heart, where its minimal pulsations wouldn't interfere with the device. It would be protected by the bone structure. The hardest part, both technically and ethically, was the antenna. To transmit the signal back to a waiting CIA surveillance van, the antenna needed length. They couldn't have a wire sticking out. That would compromise the asset immediately. The solution was as ingenious as it was macabre. A strand of fine copper wire, carefully woven and laminated with silicone, was run subcutaneously from the base of the skull, along the spine, and down the entire length of the cat's tail, ending at the very tip. This effectively turned the animal's tail into a high-gain, flexible antenna. The surgical team had a perfect techniques to prevent the wire from irritating the tissue or being rejected by the body. The initial results were catastrophic. The first 3 subjects, known only by their numbers, Subject 1, B, 2, and C3, all perished either during the lengthy, 5-hour surgery or within days of recovery. One cat, C3, experienced a massive inflammatory response to the silver oxide battery. Another one simply couldn't recover from the trauma of having its ear canal manipulated so violently. The engineers argued for a redesign, but Wallace was adamant. The concept is sound. The execution must be refined. He pushed the surgical team relentlessly. They adjusted the anesthetic protocols, switched to a hypoallergenic coating for the transmitter, and focused on maintaining absolute sterility. Finally, after nearly 2 years of trial and error, they produced their first success. Subject D, 4, a female calico with bright green eyes and a surprisingly placid temperament. She survived the operation, healed without complication, and most importantly, the equipment worked. Wallace stood in the surveillance room at the farm, listening through high-end headphones. The audio was faint but discernible. He could hear the cat's purr, the soft patting of its feet, and then a burst of clear sound. The voice of a technician saying, "Check the gain on 4." The transmission range was disappointing, only about 200 feet. But the clarity within that short radius was exceptional. The cat was now a walking, purring, high-fidelity microphone. Now came the second, equally difficult problem: training and control. How do you convince a cat, an animal legendary for its independence and defiance, to walk across a busy street, bypass 2 KGB guards, sit patiently next to a target, and then return on command? Cats obey the laws of instinct, not the commands of the Central Intelligence Agency. The engineers had built the perfect listening device. The animal behavioralists now had to build the perfect delivery system. The absurd reality of the project was about to clash head-on with the intractable will of a small feline. The engineers had solved the integration problem. The behavioral scientists, led by Dr. Agnes Thorne, now faced the far greater hurdle: feline compliance. "We can't just throw the cat over the embassy fence, Bob," Thorne argued, reviewing the initial training data with Dr. Wallace. She was a renowned animal psychologist recruited from Johns Hopkins, accustomed to working with primates and dolphins, not creatures that viewed human commands as suggestions, at best. A cat's motivation is primal: food, comfort, and hunting. They don't have the deep-seated loyalty of a dog, nor the structural intelligence of a primate. The only way this works is by manipulating its instincts. The target environment, the Soviet embassy grounds, presented a gauntlet of distractions. The complex was surrounded by bushes perfect for stalking, had pigeons ripe for the chase, and offered vast, sunny spots ideal for napping. For a cat, it was a paradise. For a spy, it was a mission-ending nightmare. The goal was narrowly defined. Subject D4, the successful calico, had to cross a specific 50-foot stretch of sidewalk, stop and linger near a predetermined bench outside the embassy wall, where KGB officers often conducted seemingly casual, yet critical, sidewalk conversations, remain there for 5 to 7 minutes, and then return to the pickup zone, where the CIA van would be parked. Dr. Thorne's team first attempted operant conditioning, the classic spy versus cat methodology. They used a combination of positive reinforcement, high-value tuna and liver treats, and a mildly aversive tone generator embedded in a remote control unit. If D4 moved toward the target area, a mock-up of the embassy bench inside their secure kennel facility, she got the reward. If she deviated, the high-pitched tone would sound, causing slight discomfort. The results were maddeningly inconsistent. The cat quickly learned to associate the sight of the bench with the smell of tuna. She would walk the line perfectly, but the moment the reward was delayed or a piece of string was introduced, her highly expensive, surgically enhanced attention span vanished. "It's not enough to teach her where to go," Thorne reported, rubbing her temples. "We need to teach her to ignore everything else. And that means we have to address the fundamental biological urges." They introduced the concept of hunger programming. D4 was kept on a tightly controlled, calorie-deficient diet leading up to her training sessions. The tuna reward became less a treat and more a crucial meal. The immediate environment around the training course was made intentionally challenging. Loud noises, fake birds on fishing lines, and even a large, disinterested dog, all designed to desensitize the cat to typical street distractions. The most bizarre, yet crucial, element of the training involved the remote control vest. Engineers designed a micro-thin harness, disguised under the cat's fur, which contained a tiny, pressure-sensitive mechanism. This device was not for control, but for minor sensory stimulation. A very light, non-painful, localized vibration applied near the cat's hindquarters. The hope was to create a conditioned reflex. Vibrate means move. Stop means stay. The vibrations were linked to a very specific, low-frequency radio signal broadcast from the surveillance van. Months bled into a year. The cost of D4's upkeep, specialized veterinary care, and the training team's salaries ballooned, turning her into arguably the most expensive single asset in the CIA's technical arsenal, a $20 million cat. By late 1966, D4 was performing reliably in the controlled environment of the farm's simulated streetscape. She could traverse the path, sit by the bench for a full 8 minutes, as long as she was sufficiently hungry, and upon a specific audio cue, a high-frequency click only the cat's enhanced hearing could pick up, return to the designated van door. Wallace, however, remained cautiously optimistic. A controlled environment is not a Russian street in D.C., he reminded Thorne. A pigeon in a cage is not the same as a live, flapping distraction. We need a live test. We need to deploy. The pressure on the team was immense. Director of Central Intelligence Richard Helms himself had asked for an update on that feline expenditure. The Cold War was escalating. Vietnam was heating up, and intelligence on Soviet intentions had never been more critical. The mission had to move from the sterile, air-conditioned confines of the lab to the harsh, unpredictable reality of the streets. The plan was set, a dry run, a low-stakes test of D4's readiness in an urban setting, miles away from the target, but complex enough to mimic the challenges of a true operation. The van was prepared. The technicians were on standby. The $20 million cat, hungry and wired, was ready to take her first, tentative steps into the world of espionage. The KGB, utterly oblivious to the bizarre biological asset being readied, went about its daily, predictable routines, never looking down, never realizing the tiny, four-legged threat they were about to face. The date was October 14th, 1967. The location was a meticulously scouted, nondescript public park bench in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., a few miles west of the Soviet embassy. This spot was chosen because it offered similar challenges: moderate pedestrian traffic, the presence of other animals, and enough ambient noise to test the sensitivity of the surgically implanted microphone. The CIA surveillance van, disguised as a telephone maintenance truck, was parked half a block away. Inside, Dr. Robert Wallace, Dr. Agnes Thorne, and a team of 3 audio technicians huddled around the monitoring equipment. The air was tense, thick with the silence of anticipation. Wallace spoke into the headset, his voice barely a whisper. Text, confirm audio reception. Confirm remote control, trigger integrity. Subject D4, the calico, was gently placed on the sidewalk near a patch of manicured grass. She looked unremarkable, perhaps a little thin, but otherwise a typical stray. She wore no collar, no visible gear, just her fur and the $20 million worth of espionage technology humming silently beneath her skin. The mission parameters were simple. D. For her to walk 60 feet down the sidewalk, settle near the designated park bench, linger for 3 minutes, and return. The technician responsible for the remote control, Agent Marcus Klein, held the small, heavy receiver box, his thumb hovering over the low-frequency trigger button. Deployment commencing, Thorne muttered, her eyes glued to the binoculars. D4 took 3 perfect, deliberate steps toward the target area. The hunger programming was working. She was focused, moving with the practiced urgency of an animal seeking a meal she knew was waiting at the destination. The audio in the van was perfect, crisp, clear sounds of the street, the distant rumble of a bus, the chirping of sparrows, the scratch of her own claws on the pavement. Then, disaster struck in the form of pure feline instinct. From behind a hedge emerged a large, gray male tabby. He was not a controlled element. He was a street veteran, territorial and confident. The tabby noticed D4 immediately. D4, despite her hunger and her training, registered the intruder. Spy training, hunger programming, and $20 million in surgical expertise evaporated instantly, replaced by a deep biological imperative, territory, and threat assessment. The calico stopped dead, her surgically implanted tail, the antenna, twitching erratically. Klein, realizing the situation had gone sideways, quickly hit the low-frequency vibration trigger. Move, the device commanded. Stay focused on the target. D4 ignored the subtle buzz completely. The gray tabby let out a low, guttural hiss. D4 responded with a high-pitched caterwaul. The next few seconds were chaos. The 2 cats squared off, spitting and arching their backs. "She's engaging the stray," Thorne exclaimed, her voice laced with despair. "She's supposed to be desensitized to other animals." Wallace pounded his fist silently on the console. "Get her back, Klein. Now." Full retrieval signal. Klein pressed the return cue, a series of 3 rapid, specific audio clicks. It was the signal associated with the largest, most immediate tuna reward. But D4 was locked in combat mode. The spy cat and the street cat clashed in a blur of fur and claws. The technicians winced as the audio feed in the van turned into an unintelligible, distorted screech of fighting cats, punctuated by the metallic ping of the microphone absorbing high-frequency violence. The fighting lasted only moments, but the mission was irreparably compromised. The gray tabby, victorious and arrogant, chased D4 into the dense underbrush of the park. "Audio lost. Tracking signal fading," shouted the lead technician. "She's off the grid." The van immediately broke cover and sped toward the park. They found the gray tabby preening calmly near the bench, the picture of nonchalant victory. Of subject D4, there was no sign. For the next 4 harrowing hours, the team conducted a frantic, covert search of the park. They couldn't use her name or describe her unique features. They were looking for a $20 million needle in a biological haystack. Finally, near a storm drain, they found her. She was shaken, slightly bruised but physically intact. Crucially, the external antenna woven into her tail was bent sharply, and the transmission was weak and broken. Back at the farm, the debriefing was brutal. "We cannot control her," Thorne confessed, defeated. "We can program her hunger, but we cannot supersede her instinct for survival, territory, or sex. The moment a competing motivation presents itself, she ceases to be an asset and becomes a cat." Wallace reviewed the technician's post-retrieval damage report. The internal components were fine, but the bent antenna would need re-surgical attention. "More time, more money." "This confirms our worst fear," Wallace said, his voice flat. "The deployment environment is not sterile. It is random, hostile, and utterly unpredictable. A stray dog, a passing motorist, a child with a ball. Any random variable cancels out the asset." However, he wasn't ready to scrap the entire project. "The technical integration is a success. We achieved clear audio pickup from a moving biological platform. The flaw is not in the technology, but in the operational environment. We simply need a simpler, less hostile mission profile. We need to reduce the variables for the final deployment." Operation Acoustic Kitty was not dead, but it was clinging to life, its fate resting on one final, desperate modification of the mission plan. They would not risk another test. The next time D4 went out, it would be the real thing, directly against the Soviet embassy, in a final, all-or-nothing gambit to justify the monumental expense and absurdity of the entire project. Following the catastrophic dry run, Dr. Wallace ordered an immediate, highly restricted meeting. The failure was clear. The environment of a typical American city was too volatile for an asset driven by instinct. The mission profile had to be surgically simplified. "We cannot eliminate the cat's nature," Wallace stated, pacing the small, windowless briefing room at the farm. "But we can limit its opportunities for distraction. The target is no longer the open sidewalk. The target is a fixed, predictable location with minimal animal traffic and maximum human activity." They pulled up the schematic of the Soviet embassy complex on Wisconsin Avenue, focusing on the exterior grounds. The main building was heavily shielded, making direct eavesdropping impossible. The breakthrough location, identified by CIA reconnaissance, was a small, walled courtyard adjacent to the main communication wing. This courtyard was used by senior KGB officers and embassy staff for highly sensitive, informal conversations, particularly during their mid-morning coffee breaks or after-hour smoke breaks. The conversations, conducted outside, were specifically intended to avoid the embassy's own bug sweeps. The courtyard was ringed by a low, ornamental hedge and a waist-high stone wall, separating it from a very narrow, quiet alleyway. Crucially, the alleyway had been confirmed to contain only minimal, sporadic human foot traffic, and was not a natural hunting ground for stray animals due to its sterile paving and lack of garbage. The revised plan is this, Wallace outlined, pointing to the alleyway on the diagram. The surveillance van, disguised this time as a utility vehicle from the District of Columbia Water Department, will park at the mouth of the alley. Subject D will be released directly into the alley. Her target is the wall bordering the courtyard. She must approach the wall, sit directly beneath it, and remain there for a minimum of 10 minutes. The challenge remained the method of persuasion. Dr. Thorne introduced the concept of olfactory anchoring. If hunger could be tied to a specific smell that was not the tuna, reward D might be focused solely on reaching that smell. We took the high-value reward, the specialized tuna preparation, and saturated it with a very unique, custom-synthesized chemical compound, Thorne explained. It has an odor that is completely alien to the cat's natural environment, but which D4 has been conditioned to associate exclusively with satiation. We call it scent alpha. The final operational modification was the introduction of a scent lure. A CIA operative working under deep cover as a city sanitation worker days prior to the deployment would subtly impregnate the target area, the base of the wall in the alleyway, with a micro-deposit of scent alpha. The cat will not be looking for food or a pigeon, Wallace concluded. She will be on a biological imperative to reach the strongest concentration of scent alpha she has ever smelled. It's an irresistible beacon. Once she is there, her natural inclination is to sit and wait for the reward. The mission was set for April 1967. The choice of day was dictated by intelligence, suggesting a high-level KGB official, Colonel Viktor Malinovsky, known to frequent the courtyard, would be in town. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were directly linked to a crucial Soviet strategic weapons program. The night before the mission, the entire team gathered for the final briefing. Dr. Reed, the surgeon, personally checked D4, verifying the antenna integrity and the battery life, which was calculated to last for only exactly 1 hour of continuous transmission. D4 was fed a restricted, calculated meal designed to leave her intensely, but not debilitatingly, hungry. She was calm, secured in a custom-built, sound-dampened carrier. In the early morning hours before dawn, the sanitation worker, the CIA operative, executed his part, leaving the invisible, potent scent alpha smear at the base of the Soviet embassy wall in the designated alleyway. April 18, 1967, 9:30 a.m. Wisconsin Avenue, Washington, D.C. The D.C. Water Department van, its exterior weathered and its roof rack carrying tools that would never be used, pulled silently into the mouth of the alleyway, just out of sight of the embassy's main gate. Inside, Wallace, Klein, and 2 technicians were ready. The low, steady static on the audio equipment represented the potential of $20 million. The target is in the courtyard, whispered the surveillance operative stationed in a decoy apartment across the street. Malinovsky is smoking a cigarette with Ambassador Gromyko's deputy. They are engaged in what appears to be a tense conversation. Wallace nodded, his jaw tight. This was it. The ultimate fusion of biology and espionage. The most absurd gamble of the Cold War. Klein, his hand trembling slightly, unlatched the carrier door. D4, sensing the freedom and, more importantly, the overwhelming, irresistible pull of scent alpha hitting her nasal receptors, paused only for a moment. Then, driven by an instinct far stronger than any training, the calico spy stepped out of the van and began her final, silent, fateful walk down the narrow alley toward the Soviet secret. April 18, 1967, 9:33 a.m. The narrow alleyway was shadowed and still. Subject D moved with an almost unnatural focus. She wasn't strolling, she was tracking. The powerful, conditioned scent of scent alpha was overwhelming her senses, creating a single-minded drive that eclipsed every other stimulus. She padded silently across the rough, paved surface, her surgically implanted antenna tail held low and steady. Inside the van, the atmosphere was a mix of religious awe and sheer terror. Wallace, Klein, and the technicians were fixated on the monitoring equipment. The radio receiver was tuned to D4's specific frequency. The only sound was the low static hiss, a sound which, in that moment, held the promise of state secrets. "She's clear of the entrance," whispered the surveillance operative, moving perfectly toward the target wall. D4 reached the stone wall, the low hedge separating the alley from the embassy courtyard. She stopped precisely at the spot saturated with the irresistible lure. Driven by the training that dictated stillness meant reward, she settled down immediately, her small body curled into a resting position, her ears pricked forward, ready to listen for the cue that never came. The cue for the tuna that she believed was imminent. The technicians quickly adjusted the gain. The static vanished, replaced by the faint, but remarkably clear, sound of human voices speaking Russian. "We have audio!" exclaimed the chief technician, his voice cracking with excitement. "Clear channel." Picking up conversation from the courtyard, Wallace snatched the headphones, pressing them tightly against his ears. He could hear the distinct, resonant voice of Colonel Viktor Malinovsky, the high-value target. The deployment schedule for Project Vostok is dependent on the latest estimate from Sector 4. Malinovsky's voice was slightly muffled, the stone wall acting as a slight acoustic dampener, but the words were understandable, crisp, and direct. The CIA had just acquired an unprecedented ear into a high-level Soviet conversation. In the van, the tension dissolved into a collective, silent euphoria. They had done it. The ridiculous, ethically dubious, and ridiculously expensive cat project was working. The bizarre gambit had paid off, proving that the fusion of biology and technology could indeed breach the impenetrable wall of Cold War espionage. Malinovsky continued, his voice growing slightly louder as he took another drag from his cigarette. "The necessary financial adjustments have been made. Moscow guarantees the necessary resources. The Americans will not anticipate." The conversation was a treasure trove, details on a strategic weapons program, confirmation of deep-level financial transfers, and insights into the Kremlin's strategic timeline. The technician, working with almost surgical precision, began recording the stream onto the high-speed magnetic tapes. Every minute D4 remained in position was a minute of priceless intelligence. Dr. Thorne, watching D4 through the binoculars, noted the cat's intense focus. The olfactory anchor was holding her captive, her instincts overridden by conditioned compulsion. She was sitting stock still, a perfect, unassuming, furry sensor platform. The conversation in the courtyard continued for a staggering 12 minutes, 2 minutes longer than the initial operational parameter. The KGB men were so relaxed in their secure, outdoor location, discussing their sensitive information, that they never once glanced into the quiet, unremarkable alleyway. "They're moving," the surveillance operative finally announced. "Malinovsky and the deputy are heading back inside." Wallace spoke into the headset, his voice calm, but radiating relief. "Klein, prepare the retrieval. Full audio cue and immediate visual confirmation of reward upon return." The mission was technically over, and it was a stunning, improbable success. All that remained was the safe extraction of the asset. Klein, ready to trigger the auditory recall cue that promised the cat its massive, scent-alpha-drenched reward, pressed the control box. A high-frequency, unique clicking sound, utterly inaudible to human ears, emanated from the transmitter near the van. D4, hearing the long-awaited signal, immediately uncurled herself, preparing to receive the food she had risked her life for. She turned and began walking back toward the van, retracing her steps down the alleyway. Just as the calico spy reached the alley's halfway point, something entirely unforeseen happened. The very randomness the CIA had spent years trying to eliminate violently intruded upon the perfect operation. A bright yellow taxicab, speeding down the adjacent Wisconsin Avenue, took the corner into the alleyway with unnecessary speed. It wasn't supposed to be there. Alleyways were not part of the standard DC taxi route. It was a completely random deviation, the inevitable stochastic variable of a major metropolis. D4, still focused on the reward queue and slightly disoriented by the abrupt sound and motion, hesitated for a fatal fraction of a second. The van crew screamed a collective, muffled no as they watched in horror. The cab driver, distracted and focused on navigating the sharp turn, never saw the low-to-the-ground calico. There was a sickening, muffled thump. The audio feed in the surveillance van immediately exploded into a cacophony of sound. The screech of brakes, the yell of the driver, and then only a deafening, absolute silence, followed by the low, unchanging hum of the dead radio frequency. Operation Acoustic Kitty had succeeded beyond the wildest technical dreams of the CIA. And then, in a single, utterly random collision, it had ended. The $20 million cat, the perfect fusion of biological and technical espionage, had been struck and killed instantly, right on the threshold of victory, ironically by the ultimate symbol of everyday civilian life. The silence that followed the catastrophic collision was more chilling than any enemy threat. Inside the van, Dr. Robert Wallace froze, his hands still hovering over the communications panel. Agent Klein stared blankly out the reinforced glass. The recording tape, now containing 12 minutes of priceless Soviet strategic intelligence, continued to spin uselessly against the sound of nothing. Retrieval, Wallace finally ordered, his voice a strained whisper, devoid of its usual authority. Immediate retrieval of the asset. We must recover the transmitter and the tapes. Get out there now, and be discreet. The technician assigned to the retrieval, Agent Dale Harris, a former medic, pulled on a reflective vest and emerged from the van, now acting the part of a startled utility worker checking on a minor accident. The yellow cab had screeched to a halt. The driver, a middle-aged man already late for his next fare, was peering out his window, shouting curses in the direction of the alley. Harris quickly assessed the scene. The cat's body lay crumpled near the curb. The cab driver, focused on potential damage to his vehicle, was oblivious to the fact that he had just destroyed a $20 million piece of U.S. government property. Harris approached the driver with a practiced, casual air. "Hey, friend, take it easy," Harris said, affecting a heavy D.C. accent. "Just a stray. Happens all the time down here. Look, no damage to your bumper. I'll handle the cleanup." He swiftly pulled a small, black garbage bag from his utility belt, a standard component of CIA field kits, used for securing evidence, or in this case, neutralizing a sensitive biological asset. The driver, relieved by the quick resolution and the guarantee of no paperwork, simply grumbled and sped away, completely unaware of the intelligence disaster he had caused. Harris scooped up the remains of subject D4, ensuring the entire body was secured. He returned to the van, his face pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. "The asset is deceased," he reported, placing the bag on the rear examination table. "Immediate physical trauma. But the tapes are secure." Wallace ignored the operational failure for a moment, focusing on the victory. "The audio? Is the audio intact?" "Yes, sir," Klein confirmed, running a quick check. 12 minutes of high-grade intelligence. Colonel Malinowski's voice clear as a bell. "It's a strategic win, technically. We have proof of Project Vostok." The van immediately left the alley, heading back toward the farm. The contrast between the brilliant success of the eavesdropping and the ludicrous nature of the asset's demise was jarring. They had managed to defeat the most sophisticated Soviet counterintelligence technology, only to be defeated by a random taxi. Back at the secure facility, the analysis was swift and brutal. The intelligence gleaned from the tapes was confirmed to be highly accurate and strategically vital, fully justifying the monetary cost. But the operational failure was undeniable. Dr. Thorne was called to personally examine D4's remains. The implanted components, the silver oxide battery, the transmitter at the base of the skull, and the fragile microphone were recovered. The final report on the cat's demise was clinical. Asset neutralized by random vehicular impact during post-mission retrieval phase. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Project viability. Terminated due to irreconcilable environmental variables. Wallace had to prepare the final brief for CIA Director Richard Helms. How do you explain to the head of U.S. intelligence that the most bizarre, expensive spy operation in history succeeded in its primary objective, but then failed because the star agent was run over by a cab? The eventual report, titled Acoustic Kitty, Final Assessment, was heavily redacted and classified top secret. It concluded that while the surgical implantation and biotechnical fusion were a remarkable technological achievement, the uncontrollable nature of the animal's will and the operational risks posed by an uncooperative living platform rendered the entire project unfeasible. The cat, they concluded, could not be relied upon to prioritize the mission over its own instincts or, worse, over a random, real-world distraction. The final intelligence from the mission, the Malinowski tapes, was quickly integrated into the U.S. strategic framework, influencing U.S. negotiating positions on arms control for months. The success was noted, and the intelligence was used. The absurdity of its origin, however, had to be erased. The story of the $20 million spy cat, the cat that had successfully breached the Iron Curtain's defenses only to meet its end under the tire of a D.C. taxi, became one of the most guarded secrets of the Office of Technical Services. All documentation was physically sealed. The components were melted down. Dr. Robert Wallace, though lauded for the technical brilliance, was strongly advised to transition his focus to inanimate objects. The project was officially marked as a total loss in terms of ongoing operability. But the legend of Acoustic Kitty was already beginning to form in the shadows of the intelligence world, a cautionary, bizarre tale whispered among analysts, a testament to how far the CIA would go and how little control they truly had over the variables of the real world. The Soviet KGB, meanwhile, remained utterly unaware of the unique threat they had faced and lost in the D.C. alleyway. Despite the extreme classification and the meticulous destruction of physical evidence, the story of Acoustic Kitty proved too outlandish, too uniquely Cold War, to remain buried forever. Within the opaque walls of the CIA's technical and operations divisions, whispers began immediately. The project quickly achieved legendary status, not for its failure, but for the sheer audacity of the concept and the absurd nature of its demise. The personnel involved, the technicians who heard the clear audio, the surgeons who performed the delicate integration, and the behavioral scientists like Dr. Agnes Thorne who watched their work undone by a stray tabby and then a taxi, carried the secret and the dark humor of it in their collective memory. It became a kind of intelligence folklore, a bizarre cautionary tale passed down in low tones during after-hours briefings. Never underestimate the unpredictable variable of the real world. Never trust a cat. The first subtle leak didn't occur until the late 1970s. During a congressional oversight hearing on CIA expenditures, a tense, wide-ranging review following the revelations of the Church Committee, a highly technical and vague reference to a bioplatform surveillance project with an unacceptable return on investment due to unforeseen environmental factors appeared in a declassified summary. The reference was quickly dismissed by the press, who were focused on more sensational revelations about assassinations and domestic spying. But for those within the intelligence community, the reference was a knowing wink. The true public unraveling began in the early 2000s, driven by the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. Historians and investigative journalists, digging through decades of declassified documents, stumbled upon the highly redacted Acoustic Kitty, Final Assessment report mentioned earlier. While heavily censored, key phrases, feline host, surgical implantation of transmitter, field termination by vehicle, provided enough context for a resourceful journalist to piece together the unbelievable narrative. One such reporter, Victor L. Andrews of the Washington Sentinel, began interviewing retired CIA operatives and technical staff under the promise of anonymity. He found that the men who had worked on the project, now aging, reflective, and less concerned with maintaining absolute secrecy, were eager to share the story, if only to prove that their technical efforts were indeed brilliant, even if the deployment was a farce. They spoke of the initial excitement, the ethical debates they were forced to ignore, the maddening inconsistency of Subject D4 during training, and the final, awful collision. Andrews' article, published in 2005 under the sensational headline, "KGB agents couldn't believe the CIA hid a listening device in a cat," instantly went viral, transforming a decades-old, classified failure into a global, viral sensation. The reaction was immediate and multi-layered. On one hand, the public was captivated by the sheer Cold War absurdity. It perfectly encapsulated the extreme paranoia and limitless budgets of the era, where no idea, no matter how ridiculous, was off the table if it promised an edge over the Soviets. People laughed at the idea of a surgically wired cat purring secrets into a microphone. The image of the highly trained feline spy being run over by a cab became an immediate, iconic symbol of bureaucratic overreach meeting mundane reality. On the other hand, the disclosure reignited fierce ethical debates. Animal rights groups condemned the CIA's treatment of D4 and the other subjects, accusing the agency of cruelty and unnecessary experimentation on sentient beings. The revelation forced the CIA to issue a rare, carefully worded statement emphasizing that the project was a short-lived experiment conducted under the extreme pressures of the Cold War, and that such biological platforms were no longer considered viable or ethical. The KGB, which had long since evolved into the modern Russian intelligence services, finally learned the truth about the strange disturbances they had sometimes noticed near their embassy wall. Reports from former KGB personnel indicated their utter astonishment. They had often suspected the CIA of using new acoustic technologies, perhaps micro-drones or laser systems, but the idea of using a cat, a common animal they dismissed as irrelevant to espionage, was simply beyond their realm of paranoia. The initial reaction among former KGB officers, according to defector interviews, was one of disbelief, followed by a grudging, dark respect for the sheer theatricality of the failed effort. The story of Acoustic Kitty thus entered the annals of Cold War history as the perfect anecdote, a story of immense technical sophistication colliding with fundamental biological reality, confirming that even in the highest-stakes game of global espionage, sometimes the smallest, most unpredictable variable, like a hungry cat or a speeding taxi, can be the one thing that brings the entire operation crashing down. The project that was meant to be a tightly held secret became one of the most widely known and widely ridiculed intelligence failures of the 20th century. The official termination of Operation Acoustic Kitty did not, ironically, in the CIA's interest in leveraging animal biology for espionage. Instead, the project became a crucial, albeit expensive, lesson in the limitations of biological platforms. The final assessment, detailing the insurmountable problems of animal autonomy and environmental stochasticity, forced the Office of Technical Services, OTS, to pivot its research toward fully mechanical and electronic solutions. The technical lessons learned from the $20 million cat were invaluable, essentially providing the roadmap for the next generation of miniaturized surveillance. Firstly, the success in miniaturization was a game-changer. The development of the tiny silver oxide battery and the wafer-thin, highly sensitive microphone represented a significant leap forward in microengineering. This technology was immediately repurposed. The same miniaturized power cell and acoustic components, originally designed for the cat, were soon integrated into inanimate objects, fake rocks, trees, and street furniture used in later, more successful static surveillance operations around Soviet targets globally. The cat's technology lived on, hidden inside lampposts and park benches. Secondly, the antenna design, though fragile on the cat, inspired new approaches to covert signaling. The idea of weaving a conductive wire into a non-traditional material, the cat's fur, led to the development of flexible, integrated antennas concealed within clothing, shoes, and even common materials like plastic and wood. The principle of using the physical form of the asset, living or otherwise, as the signal transmitter was adopted in various disguises. Thirdly, the olfactory anchoring experiment, spearheaded by Dr. Thorne, proved that even the most primal instincts could be temporarily hijacked by highly specialized, synthesized chemical cues. While D, for ultimately failed, the brief, intense focus she achieved was remarkable. This insight shifted the focus of CIA behavioral science toward using environmental factors, scent, sound, and specific light frequencies to manipulate human targets rather than animal ones. The goal shifted from trying to control a cat to trying to influence a person's movement or perception in a crowded area. However, the deepest, most peculiar legacy of Acoustic Kitty was its role in inspiring the next wave of miniaturized robotic assets, often referred to within the agency as entomological reconnaissance. If a cat was too large and too independent, what about a smaller creature that could be mechanically controlled? In the early 1970s, the CIA began work on projects like the Insectothopter, a tiny mechanical flying drone disguised as a dragonfly, designed to carry a microphone or a tiny camera. The engineers involved in this project often cited the Acoustic Kitty failure as their motivation. A mechanical bug doesn't chase a real bug, and it certainly won't get run over by a cab. The Insectothopter, though never fully deployed operationally due to challenges with battery life and wind stability, was the direct, mechanical descendant of the cat. The aim was the same: create an inconspicuous, mobile, sensory platform. But this time, the platform had to be entirely subservient to human control. The concept of the biological spy was not entirely abandoned, but it shifted its focus from mammals to simpler organisms. There were classified, short-lived studies into using migrating birds, implanting tiny, solar-power transmitters for long-range, atmospheric data collection. But the lessons of D4, the hunger, the territory, the random intervention of a taxi, remained the primary deterrent against deploying another complex, autonomous animal into an uncontrolled urban environment. Dr. Robert Wallace, despite the official failure of his most audacious project, became an internal legend. He was moved to lead the CIA's research into electronic countermeasures and remained a key figure in the OTS for decades. His willingness to push the boundaries of what was possible, even into the realm of the ridiculous, was seen by many within the agency as the true spirit of Cold War innovation. The absurdity of the CAT project was simply the price paid for radical engineering advancement. For the modern intelligence officer, Acoustic Kitty serves as a crucial case study in operational realism. It's a textbook example used in intelligence training academies to illustrate the difference between theoretical success, getting the audio, and operational viability, getting the audio and the asset back alive. The lesson is etched in the minds of analysts. When facing the complexities of human and environmental factors, a simple device hidden in a piece of trash is often a more reliable spy than a sophisticated one hidden in a highly trained animal. The cat had taught them that the simplest solution is often the most effective, a realization that was painfully and expensively earned. The immediate intelligence victory of the Acoustic Kitty operation, short-lived as it was, could not entirely overshadow the profound ethical and moral questions it raised within the Central Intelligence Agency. The project represented a significant departure from the agency's existing policies on the use of living creatures, which had historically focused on training existing animals, like dogs for explosive detection, rather than surgically altering them for purely mechanical purposes. Internal dissent began to bubble up almost immediately after the final report was circulated. Many officers, particularly those in non-technical divisions, found the entire concept deeply unsettling. The term Acoustic Kitty was often used in hushed internal conversations as a synonym for overreach or unnecessary cruelty. The loudest objections came from the agency's own veterinary and biological support staff. They argued passionately that the 5-hour surgery, the constant need for pain management, the use of Subject D as a disposable instrument, and the ultimate disregard for the animal's life violated every principle of animal welfare, regardless of the demands of national security. A classified internal memo from a senior veterinarian stated plainly, "The risk to the animal far exceeded any reasonable expectation of intelligence gain, and the procedure constitutes unacceptable stress and trauma to a sentient being." This memo was heavily suppressed, but served as a focal point for internal opposition. Dr. Agnes Thorne, the behavioral scientist, was particularly affected by the outcome. She had spent 2 years attempting to reconcile the cat's natural autonomy with the operational imperatives of the mission. She argued in her private addendum to the final report that the project was flawed from the beginning because it demanded perfect, robotic compliance from a creature defined by its independence. "We asked the cat to be a machine," she wrote. "We stripped away its natural environment, surgically modified its body, and programmed its hunger. Yet at the critical moment, its basic survival-level instinct, to flee from an immediate threat, was the only thing it followed. The ethical violation is in trying to supersede the natural design of a living thing for a technological purpose, assuming we can control the uncontrollable." Thorne subsequently requested a transfer away from any biosupport projects, citing moral objections. The ethical debate extended to the legal and political ramifications. Had the project succeeded and been exposed during deployment, the backlash would have been immense. The CIA realized that deploying a creature that could be interpreted as a biological weapon system, even a passive one, carried massive political risk. The death of the asset by random accident, rather than by enemy action, conveniently closed the door on a public relations disaster, allowing the agency to minimize the official narrative and quickly classify the file. The key outcome of this internal dissent was the establishment of a new, informal review process within the OTS, specifically tasked with evaluating any potential bioplatform projects based on criteria that included sentience risk, irreversible modification, and operational necessity versus ethical cost. While this was not a complete ban, it effectively served to shut down the pursuit of spy animals that required complex, invasive surgery or relied on manipulating deep survival-level instincts. Future animal training would be limited to non-invasive, handler-controlled scenarios, reinforcing the dog, pigeon, or dolphin programs, which had more established precedents and less extreme intervention. Furthermore, the KGB, upon learning the truth decades later, immediately leveraged the ethical angle in its anti-American propaganda, albeit subtly. They painted the CIA as a reckless, inhumane organization willing to mutilate a house cat in a desperate, ultimately foolish attempt to steal secrets. This narrative successfully framed the U.S. intelligence community not just as cunning, but as morally bankrupt. The failure of Acoustic Kitty served as a hard lesson that in the high-stakes game of espionage, public perception and internal morality are just as critical as technical capability. The story forced the CIA to acknowledge that some avenues, no matter how technically tempting, were too politically toxic and morally precarious to pursue. The $20 million hadn't just bought 12 minutes of Malinowski's voice. It had bought the agency a painful and lasting ethical education, establishing a line in the sand regarding the acceptable use of living agents that would endure for decades. The spirit of audacious invention remained, but the methods were forced to become more cautious, constrained by the memory of the highly trained calico that was simply too much of a cat to be a spy. 4 years after the fact, the most striking element of the Acoustic Kitty episode was the absolute, profound ignorance of the Soviet KGB. They remained utterly unaware that they had been successfully penetrated by a surgically enhanced feline agent. This blind spot was a crucial detail, highlighting the vast difference in technological and philosophical approaches to espionage between the two superpowers. The KGB operated on a principle of total surveillance and human threat assessment. Their counterintelligence was focused on known variables: human spies, traditional electronic intercepts, signal analysis, and highly sophisticated bug sweeps designed to detect conventional devices. The idea of the CIA expending massive resources to transform a common alley cat into a listening device was so far outside their operational doctrine, so absurdly American in its technological audacity, that it simply never registered as a possibility. KGB patrols near the DC embassy were meticulous. They checked for loitering vehicles, anomalous radio frequencies, and suspicious individuals. They were looking for parabolic microphones hidden in briefcases or CIA agents disguised as street sweepers. When they saw the yellow taxi, their immediate assumption, had they noticed the incident at all, would have been that it was merely an everyday annoyance, not the final act of a high-stakes espionage mission. The lack of KGB awareness meant that the intelligence gathered from the Malinowski tapes, the 12 minutes of conversation about Project Vostok, was treated by the CIA as uncompromised information for a significant period. This made the intelligence exceptionally valuable. The tapes confirmed that the Soviet Union was dedicating a far greater percentage of its national budget and scientific resources to Project Vostok than U.S. analysts had estimated. The project, which was confirmed to involve a new generation of solid-fuel ballistic missiles, SFBMs, indicated a potentially game-changing shift in the strategic nuclear balance. Unlike liquid-fueled missiles, SFBMs could be stored and launched quickly, drastically reducing the time the U.S. would have to respond to an attack. The tapes also provided details on the specific financial architecture being used to conceal the funding of Vostok, which led the CIA's Financial Intelligence Division to identify and monitor a complex network of Soviet shell companies in Europe. This was a critical secondary victory, allowing the U.S. to track the flow of money intended for the project and potentially disrupt the supply chain for key components. Director Richard Helms, upon receiving the classified summary of the Malinowski intelligence, reportedly focused solely on the strategic value, consciously compartmentalizing the bizarre means by which it was acquired. The intelligence was immediately shared with the White House and the Pentagon, leading to a crucial, top-level reevaluation of U.S. defense, spending, and missile development. The United States accelerated its own SFBM programs, directly crediting the information gleaned from the Biological Reconnaissance Platform for the shift in strategy. For months, the Malinowski tapes were the backbone of the U.S. intelligence community's understanding of the Soviet strategic roadmap. The information allowed American negotiators to adopt more assertive positions in back-channel talks, knowing precisely what resources the Soviets were prioritizing and where their weaknesses lay. The temporary advantage provided by the CAT was measurable, tangible, and impacted global policy. Yet, every time the intelligence was cited, the officials who knew the source shared a silent, profound acknowledgement of the absurdity. The fate of global strategy, the spending of billions of dollars, and the delicate balance of nuclear deterrence were, for a brief window in 1967, dependent on the internal acoustics of a surgically modified calico cat that was then violently dispatched by an ordinary taxi. The KGB's oversight confirmed the underlying brilliance of Wallace's concept. The ultimate infiltration device is one that the enemy refuses to believe is possible, even when it's sitting right under their nose. The lesson was learned on both sides, though decades apart. For the CIA, never again trust an autonomous animal. For the KGB, never dismiss the absurd. The story of Acoustic Kitty, the multi-million-dollar spy asset terminated by a 50-cent cab fare, did not fade into the dusty archives of intelligence history. Instead, it grew in stature, morphing into an enduring cultural touchstone and the perfect distillation of the Cold War's profound absurdity. It became a narrative that transcended espionage, speaking to the universal themes of technological hubris, bureaucratic waste, and the uncontrollable chaos of the real world. Decades after the event, when the once classified files were declassified and journalists like Victor L. Andrews revealed the full, unbelievable saga, the public reaction secured the project's legacy. The CAT, often referred to simply as D, in technical histories, became a posthumous celebrity. The incident is now widely studied in university courses on intelligence history and strategic studies. It is cited not merely as a technological failure, but as a classic example of the law of unintended consequences in operation. Analysts use it to illustrate how even the most brilliant, resource-intensive plans can be instantaneously derailed by low-probability, high-impact events. The black swan event of the intelligence world. The simple, yellow taxi became a powerful metaphor for the unpredictable variable that intelligence agencies, for all their power and budgets, can never fully eliminate. Furthermore, the story provides critical insight into the psychological landscape of the Cold War. The environment of existential threat and ideological rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union created a situation where no idea was too outlandish and no expense was too high if it promised even a marginal advantage. The willingness of Dr. Robert Wallace and his team to seriously pursue the notion of a cyborg cat underscores the desperate, often frantic, search for an edge that defined the era. It shows a period when the line between science fiction speculation and classified government project was incredibly thin. Culturally, Acoustic Kitty has been referenced in numerous spy novels, films, and television shows, always serving as a source of dark humor and disbelief. Its fame far outstrips many of the CIA's genuinely successful, but more mundane, espionage operations. The image of the highly trained, surgically altered calico cat, oblivious to its role in global strategic competition, wandering toward a critical rendezvous, is an irresistible narrative element. A comedic, yet tragic, symbol of the clash between man's ambition and nature's indifference. Even within the intelligence community today, the term Acoustic Kitty has entered the operational lexicon as a shorthand warning. When a new project seems too complicated, too expensive, or relies too heavily on an asset that is difficult to control, a senior officer might simply caution, let's avoid an Acoustic Kitty situation. It is a permanent, cautionary tale against over-engineering a problem or assuming total control over a living system. The most lasting historical impact, however, remains the technical foundation that the failure established. The investment, though wasted on the cat, funded the development of miniature surveillance gear that will be used effectively for the next 2 decades. The engineers realized the power lay not in the biological host, but in the miniaturized components themselves. The $20 million cat was essentially a spectacularly expensive prototype for a generation of microtransmitters and tiny power supplies, technology that would later be successfully concealed in everything from belt buckles to dental fillings. The memory of the Calico Spy, Subject D4, thus stands as a unique monument, a creature that performed its mission perfectly, securing critical intelligence that influenced the balance of power, only to be undone by the most mundane, human variable. The KGB never knew it was eavesdropped on by a cat. The world knew the story and laughed. And the CIA learned an unforgettable, multi-million-dollar lesson. When dealing with the Cold War, you can control the technology, but you can never truly control the cat.